The National Endowment for Liberty presents At Issue, the in-depth forum on freedom in America today. Hello, I'm Mike Hayes. The host of At Issue is the physician, author, and former member of Congress, Ron Paul. Ron?
Thank you, Mike. Today's issue is a tough one for many people because at first glance it seems entirely wrong. The subject is the war on drugs, and if you don't think we're winning it, keep an open mind as we consider a whole different approach. What would happen if we tried legalizing drugs? The possibilities may surprise you.
Our program, as always, will consist of our probe report on what's at issue, reactions from a group of average citizens somewhere in the country, and an analysis of the entire subject by a knowledgeable panel of experts. We'll begin our probe report, Casualties of the Drug Wars, following this brief message.
This is one in a series of programs that takes a fresh look at critical issues affecting how you live and how you use your natural rights as an individual to make decisions about your life. At Issue is brought to you by the National Endowment for Liberty because we agree with Thomas Jefferson that government governs best that governs least. The National Endowment for Liberty is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational project. We do not accept state or federal funds. In fact, we don't count on any agency of government at any level to keep this program on the air. Instead, we count on the generous gifts of individuals, people just like you. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. If you missed any part of this message, keep your pencil and paper handy. This information will be repeated.
Narcotics used to be perfectly legal in this country. Not harmless, but not worth the trouble of banning. Then, in 1914, in the same spirit that would lead to alcohol prohibition a few years later, Congress outlawed drugs. If it's bad, people said, there ought to be a law against it.
There's a natural attitude that if a substance is bad, it ought to be illegal. But that is really not the principle we operate a free society by. In the United States, among the products that are legal are tobacco, Playboy magazine, and the Communist Manifesto. Now, I think a lot of people would think that all three of those products are pretty harmful. What we do believe in a free society, though, is that the consequences of outlawing any of those things would be worse than the consequences of allowing them to be sold.
Say the words drug legalization, and most people think you want to encourage drug use, give in to the drug dealers, condone the crime and violence they spread. But for a growing number of Americans, that's not the point at all.
We are trying to put those guys out of business. What ended the Al Capone era in Chicago? What ended the murders in Chicago during alcohol prohibition? The end of prohibition did. What would destroy Rayful Edmonds? What would destroy the Jamaican drug gangs, the LA Crips? Take away their black market profits. Legalize it.
Drug laws drive up the price of drugs. I mean, we're talking about taking a $2 a day heroin habit and turning it into a $200 a day habit. Now, nobody has to knock over old ladies on the street to pay for a $2 a day habit, but to get $200 a day, you do. We estimate that something like half the street crime in major cities is a result of addicts trying to pay for a habit that they could easily afford if it were legal. Now, the more dramatic kind of crime that's being created these days is shootouts between dealers. That's what has caused 300 drug-related murders in Washington, D.C. this year. Again, we don't see shootouts between automobile dealers or between liquor dealers. We only see that kind of violence in an illegal market.
We're paying for it with overcrowded jails and prisons and courts that don't work. We're paying for it in unsolved murders. Our taxes are just out of control. And if you want to know one reason why, it's the war on drugs.
The failure of the decades-old war on drugs has led many careful thinkers, people who in no way favor drug usage, to think that maybe, just maybe, there ought not to be a law.
Many journalists, pundits, and economists, and of course Secretary Shultz is one himself, are expressing a willingness to significantly rethink this issue. Some are politically conservative writers such as William F. Buckley and Milton Friedman. Others are politically liberal journalists who, for reasons of conscience and genuine concern about the effects of decriminalization on the urban poor have traditionally opposed decriminalization. William Raspberry and Mike Royko are cases in point, yet they too have recently written of the seeming futility of spending more money and imposing more coercive laws in order to stop people from using drugs.
Mayor Schmoke is a former criminal prosecutor. This man, Ralph Salerno, is a retired New York City policeman.
Some of the real victims in this war are the law enforcement officers who are giving their lives. There have been more New York City policemen killed in the last several years through drug enforcement than any other matter that they have to deal with. There have been more federal agents who have given their lives, literally, and dozens of more who've been seriously wounded. That's one of the reasons why I am involved.
We can keep doing what we're doing, and that isn't working. We can have massive crackdowns, and we've heard all kinds of proposals, not only shooting down airplanes that we can't identify as they enter the United States. Mayor Koch has talked about strip searching everybody who comes into the United States. We have heard proposals for blowing up ships and machine gunning the survivors in the water. That came from a U.S. congressman. We've talked about ringing our southern border with troops. We have talked about giving up our rights against illegal search and seizure and so on. There was a law review article recently called "The Emerging Drug Exception to the Bill of Rights." That is, courts are just allowing the government essentially to suspend the Bill of Rights in order to fight the drug war. But I think an important thing to remember here is we can't keep drugs out of our prisons. So that means we could turn America into a giant prison and we still wouldn't be able to keep drugs out of it. The other approach, it seems to me, is to legalize, to decriminalize, to say not that drugs are good, not that they're harmless, but that the costs of outlawing them are greater than the benefits.
If your natural instinct is to favor an even stronger war on drugs, consider what it means. Never-ending U.S. military action overseas with certain troop and civilian casualties. Vast increases in our court and prison capacity. Giving the police the right to enter your home without notice to look for drugs. A system of universal drug testing. And on that point, remember that even if we had a test that was 99% accurate, which we don't, universal testing would mean that 1.5 million people would be falsely accused of drug violations every time the test was given. Once upon a time, our nation tried what was called a noble experiment, making a drug called alcohol illegal. Consumption of the drug didn't go down very much, but crime and violence went way up, and millions of otherwise law-abiding Americans became criminals for visiting a local speakeasy. Contaminated and overly powerful liquor killed hundreds in what today would be called an overdose. Now, new ghetto gangs are following in the footsteps of the Prohibition-era mafia with the same results. And so, more and more Americans are beginning to ask whether the solution may not be the same too. Whether our anti-drug laws shouldn't go the way of prohibition, and with them, the violence, the burglaries, the overdoses, and the murders.
Remember when life was simpler and problems were solvable? When you could rely on good common sense and your own honesty and initiative to see you through? That was back before government regulation got so tangled up in our public and private lives, before paperwork and arbitrary rules took over and individual choice was locked out. The National Endowment for Liberty believes that most of our problems cannot be solved by government, that too much government is in itself a problem, not a solution. These programs are made possible as a public service by people who believe that moral and political rights go hand in hand with economic freedom. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Liberty can set you free.
The war on drugs is not working, and that during Prohibition. I agree that if you make it legal, and I mean, you're not going to stop much of it, a lot of it. There's still going to be the drug overdose, but maybe legalizing it, maybe the government would use the money more wisely.
Bottom line, my concern is how many people are using it and how young they are when they start and how easily accessible it is.
Each week on At Issue, we show the probe report you've just seen to a randomly selected group of citizens somewhere in the United States. What you're watching now is actual footage of the unrehearsed reactions of a group of people in Davenport, Iowa, to the probe report, Casualties of the Drug Wars.
10,000 troops on the Mexican border, shoot anybody that moves. It's not going to work because it's going to come from somewhere else anyway. Plus, you're going to have the people here. You've got to make it a multifaceted approach, and you have to cover all the bases.
I think we need a stronger war against it. All-out war, real tough one.
Okay. The only problem with John's idea of bringing the troops back from Europe or Asia or wherever and ringing the borders like they were talking about in the clip is you're not going to do anything for the desire of those people that have it now. I mean, there's laws against it now. It's not working. You know, people are still getting the cocaine. Maybe if we did try legalizing it, then we'd have some control over it.
Well, I basically have two concerns. One is that we get a hold of the drug problem. The other is that we all maintain our rights in the process. And it seems to me that since drugs are illegal and we're not controlling them by making them illegal, that we have to look at our rights, which I think are being walked on as in the testing that employers do for drugs, and make drug use legal. That way we still won't have changed the drug situation, but the rest of us will have maintained our rights.
Did you sense the frustration in the documentary?
I sense a frustration here.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there is. Frustrating question.
It's a tough one.
Safety for children, safety for people. People feel safe and secure. They can do lots of things, and I think, you know, caring for one another. I mean, we're all going to have to do it for ourselves. Everyone's going to have to be involved to do it. I really think so. But I'm not sure that some legalization, I don't know, I agree. I mean, it would be awesome beyond, but there are a lot of different avenues, and they all need to be challenged and to be worked on.
You can make the whole country a prison, like the man in the videotape was saying, but you're not going to make the drug problem stop. You will take away all kinds of rights for people who aren't using drugs to begin with. So I don't think that there's any point in it.
Maybe we ought to do is when we leave here, hit our knees and pray for some divine intervention or something. I don't know. I don't think we as humans can do. I don't know what we can do. We sure mess it up.
Well, let's see if our At Issue panel of experts has any ideas about how to unmess it. Joe Sobran is a syndicated columnist and Washington editor of the National Review. Nancy Lord is a medical doctor and researcher who's written extensively on the subject of drug legalization. And our host and regular panelist is the chairman of the National Endowment for Liberty, Ron Paul. Ron, people seem clearly frustrated with what's happening, but not convinced that legalization is the answer.
You know, I think that is the case. I think it's pretty clear that the people know that what we're doing today isn't working. It's very clearly we're spending more and more money. We're intruding more and more on our personal liberties, yet the American people are still very, very unhappy. I think there is a lot of frustration, and yet I really believe there's starting to be a change in attitude. I believe I'm starting to sense it. I think we can see it in the discussants on this program. I think that you can see it in the literature. When we see both liberal and conservative writers starting to talk about this, I think there's a change in attitude. And I was wondering, Joe, in your capacity as a writer and lecturer, have you sensed this as well?
Yes, somewhat. I think what's been going on is that people have felt that a kind of virtuous compulsion to say we've got to fight drugs and use the biggest weapons we have. You know, you get this blast 'em attitude, but now they're starting to think with a little more refinement about it. And just, well, my old mentor Jim Burnham used to say, where there's no solution, there's no problem.
Well, does that suggest that maybe the problem is blown out of proportion?
Well, I think it's a lot of problems. I think basically there's a drug problem that individuals have, and there's a crime problem that is the public problem. And you can solve the crime problem publicly by stopping the war on drugs. The individual problem has to be fought in different ways.
And we still have a drug problem, but less of a legal problem. I might ask you that, Nancy, since you've been trained in both medicine and in law. There's a big difference on solving a problem that's medical and social versus solving a problem that's legal. You know, if somebody's out causing violence, I mean, we have to do something about it. But if we do have a problem, what would you suggest that we do? Or would you agree that it's more medical or more legal?
The drug problem itself is a medical problem. The crime problem is a legal problem. What Joe said is correct. There are two problems here. I also feel that legalization creates a lot of opportunities to work on the medical end of it as well, because I think we have a better chance of keeping it out of the hands of children if it were legalized than we do today. The kids wouldn't be selling it at school. They wouldn't be lured by drug dealers who want a kid because the kid isn't going to be facing as much hard time and is not as likely to turn them in if caught.
And yet, the other side uses that argument against us, and they say, you know, if we legalize it, we're just literally endorsing the use of the drug, and we're giving it to the kids.
I disagree with that. A kid has an easier time getting crack at school than he does beer. I think some of the kids would be able to get it all the time. That's true. And probably all of them might have a chance now and then. But they wouldn't all be exposed to it constantly as they are today. If you talk to drug addicts, 80% of them started in their youth. If you could keep it out of the hands of half of those people, they probably would never start using drugs. I think in the long term, you would see a reduction in drug use.
So there'd be two ways. If drugs were legal, you'd both protect children. You would not endorse the concept that you could sell drugs to children,
right,
but you would also take away the incentive. Of course, this is true on campuses, high school campuses, college campuses. There's a great incentive for the drug dealer to come in and push drugs, but as I've often mentioned, you never see drug dealer pushing six-packs
right.
on campuses. They're not there.
Nobody says, hey kid, try some Thunderbird. And you don't see liquor store owners running around in Mercedes with gold chains.
Yes.
In a city where the kids are facing McDonald's and minimum wage.
Yes, it would be very difficult to make that choice. You know what, $4.50, $5 an hour versus hundreds and hundreds of dollars per day. So we are literally delivering this to the campuses. Do you agree with that, Joe, that children would still be protected to some sort in a legalized society, a legal society where drugs were permissible?
Well, I'd hope so. I don't know exactly what would happen, and I don't pretend to. And by the way, according to a piece in the New York Times the other day, you know, there are a lot of people in the drug trade who really aren't making much money. I mean, the low-level runners or minimum wage workers risking their kneecaps, in essence. But I don't know. I just don't think it would be worse than what we have now. And when Jefferson said that government's best that governs least, what I think he meant was not that anarchy is desirable, but that you shouldn't have laws that require too many cops.
Do we have any evidence, either one of you know, if we have any evidence to show that the strict laws of this century have really helped to reduce the usage of drugs? I mean, how many people, what percentage of people use drugs now versus, say, 75, 80 years ago?
Oh, it's gone up by many, many factors. It's much worse now than it was in 1919 when we made it illegal. The use of cocaine, many more people are using cocaine today. In 1919, when it was made illegal, you didn't have a huge criminal enterprise solely for the purpose of bringing cocaine into this country. That has all developed over the past decade or so.
It seems like something must have happened in this century. You know, a lot of things occurred in this century that rejected the notions of the founders of this country, where the responsibility of solving difficult social and medical problems fell on whom? The individual. You know, the individual was supposed to solve some of these problems. It seemed like when the individual was dealing with it, quite frankly, I think we had less of these problems. But I don't think this would satisfy a lot of people who are concerned about legalization. They are very concerned, and their biggest concern is that we're going to endorse it. Yeah. You know, this idea that you want to have a law against it, that means you endorse the use of drugs. And I think the analogy is very legitimate to say that people, you know, there are a lot of things that we legalize that we don't endorse. Religions, philosophies, and personal habits. And of course, if we want to make a society better, we could start talking about getting rid of alcohol and cigarettes.
Cholesterol too.
Let's hold that thought for just a moment while we take a brief break. We'll return to more views and comments on the subject at issue in just a moment.
Throughout this series of programs, you will see ideas examined that affect every part of your life. We'll look at issues from a new angle, not from the left or the right, but from the perspective of individual liberty and responsibility. We believe our founding fathers were right. We are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is the right to life, liberty, and property. We do not accept your money transferred through state or federal government agencies. Instead, this series is funded by direct voluntary gifts from individuals. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Call us right now, 1-800-333-3545, extension 909. For a transcript of this program, specify the subject and send $5 in a stamped self-addressed envelope to P.O. Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. The National Endowment for Liberty, providing information on America's most precious resource, individual freedom.
Okay, we're back. Now, Ron, before the break, you were speaking to the point of individual responsibility.
Yes, I believe in a free society, the individuals tend to solve the problems of a society. And if we had a situation where drugs were legal, that people had access to them, we would still have some problems to deal with, you know, the usage of drugs. But I believe there are some examples of times where the marketplace has come along and have tended to solve some of these problems. For instance, with the use of alcohol and cigarettes, where education and different developments occur. And when they're legal, the opposite occur. Are you familiar with any of these things?
Yes. Well, look what's happened with alcohol. We have a trend now to wine coolers instead of cocktails. With cigarettes, we not only have a 30% reduction in the number of smokers, but those that smoke low tar. But just the opposite thing happens in the case of illegal drugs. It used to be pot was big. Then they brought in Coke. Because Coke is smaller, it's easier to hide. They make more money on it per suitcase imported. But Coke wasn't even the worst thing we experienced. Then it became crack, little hard rocks that they can hide in a cigarette. And now we have ice, a particularly lethal form of smokable speed.
Right. Joe, you know, there's been some changes occurring here this last decade or so. We've had changes. We've heard about the RICO law of property being confiscated without due process and proof of guilt. Also, we see some of this happening sometimes with the Internal Revenue Service. They confiscate property before anybody's been proven guilty of anything. And also the drug laws, I think, is in this category. Do you think this should be of a concern to the American people that even in the name of drugs, what happens with the confiscation of property, then they take this property and even try to spend that property without even going through the Treasury?
Sure, when you start a holy war and diabolize some enemy, then you're going to have a kind of trampling on all other legitimate concerns that ought to be taken into account. And this is a great case in point. This military metaphor always bothers me, you know, war on drugs, war on poverty.
Yeah.
How do you define victory?
That's right. It could go on
and
endlessly.
what casualties? How many casualties are you willing to take?
You know, I think it's hard to second guess motivations, but sometimes I think about and wonder about the motivation of some who might like to have this war on drugs, whether it has to do with funding some illegal activities, some CIA activities, some FBI activities, and without this evil monster out there, the use of drugs, to justify this, it would be very difficult. They can't go to the Congress and literally say, well, we need this money to run this illegal operation, and yet it's difficult for me to accept the idea that we would have people in office that would deliberately do this. But I think there's some evidence to show this. Do you think this should be a concern for us?
I think they must be having some fun flying around in helicopters. That's much sexier than giving drug treatment or setting up educational programs. I think they are getting a big kick out of it.
Yes.
They're the Miami Vice.
Joe, over the years, I've come across a lot of people who have changed their opinion about drugs, and they start to realize that these programs aren't working. Have you always had your opinion about the drugs where these laws aren't doing so good, or have you changed your opinion?
Yeah, I've changed my mind in the last year or so, really.
Is that right?
Yeah, until then I thought, yeah, let's wipe them out. Let's get rid of it. Do whatever it takes. And then I started thinking about what that would really mean, and I saw we weren't winning it. These things are never going to go away. What's the intelligent way to minimize it?
So it was more or less a practical reason rather than a basic philosophic
well, it
reason.
started out that way. A lot of things do, and then somehow you develop kind of
fit
philosophical
the philosophy into it.
Yeah. Well, your philosophy has to fit the facts, after all.
Well, I don't think it's very difficult to fit the philosophy of liberty into a position where we don't expect the government to solve all these problems, social, medical problems that we have. And for that reason, I think both the practical and the philosophic supports this position.
Folks, our time's getting short. We need to wind this up. And the way we like to do that is by focusing on the next step. So, Nancy Lord, very briefly, what is the next step? What's the first thing we ought to do to move toward a more rational policy?
I think first we have to talk to people and get them to think about what these policies are doing to the police and to the kids. The police are being killed because they're overwhelmed with a problem there's no way they can control. And the kids are being pulled into a criminal enterprise by the time they're 9 years old.
Joe Sobran, what's the next step we ought to take in a matter of crime and drugs?
Well, I'd say disband the war on drugs and admit that this is not the way to solve any of the problems that are associated with drugs. We have to recognize it's not a crime, it's not a right to take drugs, it's a vice. It belongs in that large category of things that we regard as undesirable but tolerable.
And Ron Paul, what's your view?
You know, Mike, the first 140 years of our history in this country, we did not have drug laws, and we survived rather well. The individual liberties were protected, and now in the last 75 or 80 years, we've had this concentrated effort to outlaw drugs. I think it's time the American people woke up, started to realize and started to ask the right questions, not to accept in a blind fashion the propaganda they hear on television, put it in proper perspective, and when they realize that the propaganda, the drug war really isn't working, it isn't proper, it isn't the technique to be used in a free society, I think the American people then will tell the Congress what they ought to do.
Well, that's where we'll have to leave it. I want to thank our panelists and you for watching. We'll be back next week with another vital topic at issue.